my quilting friends! My name is Leah Day, and today I am quilting on my Q-Zone Hoop Frame Pro, and I am quilting on our Dream Big panel. So I only had a little bit left to do. This was a panel that we did a little quilt along with it over the spring, and then I had to put it away due to our renovation, and now I pulled it back out again, and I only have a few feathers to quilt in some of the petals. So I have put the quilt on the frame, and I put it on the frame in a very unique way, and I wanted to share that in this video, as well as how I am quilting with the feather ruler on a frame. Few little things that you kind of have to keep in mind whenever you're doing this. So very first thing, I have loaded this in here, and as you can see, I have not loaded it straight. This is in here at a weird angle. So here is a close-up of this weird side of the quilt on the frame. And this is the side of the quilt, meaning this is the straight side. And as you can see, I put it in here pretty much at a 45-degree angle, which might seem really odd, but this is something special that you can do with hoop frames, because hoop frames work like a traditional lap quilting hoop. You can put the quilt in there and you can focus on that space that you need to quilt, that area that you want to knock out, and you can clamp it down and hold it in place just so that you can knock out that one area. So here's the method behind the madness. The reason why I loaded the quilt this way is because I had this space to quilt, and this space is long and narrow, okay? It's at this angle to the quilt, and if I had loaded it straight, well, then that space would probably have come in, you know, kind of running like that, and it might have been more space than what I had space to quilt with my whole machine here. Now, if you have a bigger machine, like a Qnique 15 or Qnique 19 on your hoop frame, then it doesn't matter, because you can definitely knock this out, whether it was vertical or horizontal or 2-1 angle, it doesn't matter. But when you have a limited amount of space on this frame, when you're using a home sewing machine, then you need to think about how you're loading it, particularly when you have a lot of freedom that you can load it any way you want. Most of this quilt is quilted. I've already knocked out most of it, so I have freedom to load this however I want, so that way I can knock out these spaces so I can stitch. Basically, I started here and I quilted each feather in a row, and I didn't have to stop until I was completely done with that segment. If I had loaded it differently, then it wouldn't have been the end of the world. Please don't get me wrong. I would have just had to quilt some of the feathers, and then I would have had to stop, break thread, advance the quilt through the frame, get started again, stitch a few more feathers. That's a little annoying and it takes a lot of time. So tip on this, if you decide to do a weird load like this, then what you're gonna do, you're gonna just load it first, go ahead and clamp it in place. Use these side leader cloths. So this is the Q-Zone leader cloth. It is specific to this frame. It comes with these little squares. I pin this along the side of the quilt and then clamped it. I've got my side clamps here attached, and you can see that that really nicely locks and pulls that whole side this way. I had a little tail of the leader cloth. I was able to tuck that under that back clamp and latch that in place too. So you just sometimes have to be kind of creative whenever you're doing a weird load like this, but it absolutely works. And remember, the reason I did this is I want to be able to quilt that space all in one pass. So I've got this area all prepped up. Let me show you how I quilted that all in one pass. So I'm getting started here, and this is a little awkward just to try and figure out the best way to get started. The main thing to remember, we always set the stage with the curve of the ruler, and remember, we'd like the feathers to kind of curl up and around that leaf. So I like this. I'm going to stitch just this short little segment, and then I'll be ready for the next feather. So sometimes we have a few small feathers to start, and then we can get into the full-size ones. So I'm using a sure stitch, and that's helping me create nice even stitches and be able to not have to use my foot pedal. So I really like that. And I'm just pulling it around and up. Now, a few things that I'm having trouble with. The quilt's moving quite a bit. You see how much play I've got there. Let me see if I can tighten this up a bit with my clamps here, my clips. And this is the thing, because so much of this quilt is already quilted, that might make this just a little bit on the tricky side. But it also could be that I'm putting too much pressure on the ruler as well. So there we go. I gave that a little bit of a tighten. That looks just It's a little firmer. Okay, so now I'm going to line up the ruler, and back here is really what I'm looking at, and of course you can't see that because the foot's in the way. But basically I'm trying to line up the curve of the ruler so I'm about 1/4 inch away from this line of stitching on the leaf. And I'm also going to line up the edge line of the ruler with this little line from the feather before. So kind of eyeballing, but things, and it doesn't have to be perfect, remember? Click things on. Oh, so much easier. So much easier. Swing it down, and remember, I can go fast, I can go slow, and I've got a stitch regulator now, so my stitches are going to stay the same size. Click that off, move my ruler. Here we go. And you know, remember, the edge lines aren't going to line up perfectly because we're doing curves with this and fitting it into this odd space versus quilting it into a straight line, which is what the ruler is etched for. So those lines are kind of guidelines, but they're probably not going to be perfect as we quilt up this leaf. So here we go. Again, lining up. It's just that, you know, it's kind of a guideline. It's generally like if I had the ruler like this, the feather wouldn't look so nice. It would look kind of blocky. To make a feather look nice, you have this nice tapering, and that makes it look a little bit more delicate. And then here, I'm making sure I've got that 1/4 inch from the ruler to that stitching line. That looks good. Click the machine on. And you know, if you're not using a sure stitch, just keep in mind your foot pedal works just fine. In this case, I would just press firmly as you are moving the machine firmly. Remember, do not move the machine without giving it some gas, because otherwise your needle is still in the down position. That can cause you some problems. A speed controller is a little different, and I have videos on all of these different options. So definitely give those a watch if you are curious, if you're a little confused about exactly how I'm doing this and having, you know, all of these stitches the same size and shape, even though sometimes I'm going a little fast, sometimes I'm going a little slower. All right, so here we go. This is like the tip of the iceberg, and I need to decide if I'm going to change, and I think I probably will. I'll probably bring the feathers up the opposite direction. So this is going to be the tip, and again, line that up nicely there, and then 1/4 inch here. This looks good. And just always remember, guys, you make a mistake, don't freak out about it. Don't worry too much. It's all going to come out in the wash, and this really looks great. I am super pleased with that, and I hope you can see just how much faster this is quilting on the frame versus pushing the quilt through the machine. Compare the videos where I quilted the feathers on a whole machine pushing, because I really think that that's a lot more time consuming. This feels a lot faster. So at this point, I need to advance the quilt. This is as much as I can quilt comfortably. If I could stitch a few more probably, but I might run out of space and end up with like a half feather, and I would rather not do that. So I'm going to go on ahead and advance the quilt through the machine, and I'll meet you back here in a second. So I've got that segment done. I'm going to go on ahead and remove all of my clamps. And remember, these front and side clamps, you just lift the side. If you try and pull like this, it usually doesn't really like you all that much. It won't come off really. I'm going to unpin, because most likely I'm going to have to shift and adjust this leader cloth square over here, and unclamp the back too. Now, it's up to you if you want to leave your needle down. Let's say you were in a position where you were going to continue quilting in that direction. I'm pretty sure I'm going to start down here and work my way up through that petal. So I'm going to actually break thread. To do that, I'm going to needle up on my machine. I'm going to pull the machine over. Keep in mind your foot actually is down, so you need to lift your foot so that way you have some slack. There we go. Drop my foot back down again. And okay, so let's say you don't have a thread cutter. I mean, I was going to go and reach for my thread cutter, but I know a lot of people don't have thread cutters. So here's what you do. If you don't have a thread cutter, you're going to shift the machine over. You're going to needle down, needle back up again, lift the foot, pull it away, and then you're going to pull on that top thread. That top thread will pull up a loop. That is your bobbin thread. And then you're going to clip that and that breaks your bobbin thread and your top thread. Oh, I forgot to clip this top thread. There we go. Okay, now I'm going to go back to where I have that thread break. I'm going to just pick at that. I just tug on that top thread a little bit, and that will pull up a loop. That loop is my bobbin thread. Bring that to the surface, then I can tie off and bury both thread tails. Now, of course, it's easier whenever you have that thread cutter that's really, really nice, not a requirement, because this is basically that pulling up method that I just showed you. That's how I break thread on my long arms, because my long arms do not have thread cutters. Okay, looks like I need to take off this clamp because I'm going to be going in a slightly different direction. I might end up having to move all of that over to the other side because I think I've got kind of a different direction going on this time. So here is the space that I need to quilt. So that long space, I know if that was in the frame vertical, I know I definitely would not have space to quilt that. But if I put it in here like this, and I have that running parallel to the rails on the frame, and I can test this. I can roll the machine back and forward, and so long as that space fits, you know, as long as I have plenty of space to quilt that section, then I'm good. And this is actually ending up a little bit straighter, so the quilt's actually straighter to the frame than it was before. So I like to clamp from the middle and then do the two sides. Sorry, the middle of the back rail is what I meant by that. And then I always test myself again, because once you clamp, like I'm going to need to be able to connect and stitch possibly along the line of that back feather. And now that's a little tight. That's a little questionable. So I'm actually going to, you know, move this a little bit. So this is the thing, you know, you kind of have to get it in there, give it a clamp, see what it looks like. And then if it's not quite right, just remember you can always adjust. And I always check and adjust with the back clamps. I'd like to start with the back clamps first, just simply for this reason, because it's just so much easier to know instantly if you're gonna need to move that around. And now here, I can definitely connect. I can hit all of those lines. That looks really good. So now that I got those in place, I'm gonna roll the machine over here just to get it out of my way. And I'm gonna roll up the quilt. And it's at a subtle angle. And I did not put leader cloth on the edge of the quilt simply because I knew it was going to be at this kind of weird angle, and it would probably have been more of a hindrance than a help in this particular situation, because of course it wouldn't be straight to however I'm hooping the quilt at any particular time. So this looks good. I just rolled it up. Grab my elastic clamps, bring those around. And this is why we want to, you know, just pay a little attention to those shapes and angles, because every time you have to stop and shift your quilt, it just takes a little bit of time to get everything back started again. That clamp needed a little bit of slack. There we go. And I've got one more over here. Just a little clamp there. Okay. That looks good. This is my side clamp. Just slide the fabric over that side, give it a click. And then this was the thing that I found the fabric was just a little puddly, and it was not wanting to let me. I was having trouble because I was pressing really hard with the ruler, and then the quilt was shifting quite a lot. So here's the thing, I take and hold onto the bottom of the quilt. Might even help to like roll it up just so that you're getting kind of that whole edge, and pull down on it while you press down on that clamp. And that looks good. You don't want it mega tight. That's not the goal here. You want it nice and bouncy and springy. You want it to not move the quilt when you're moving the machine over it with the foot down. You know, it's moving it a little bit, but not a lot. A little bit of drag is okay. And I'll just do this clamp. I don't have anything to quilt over here. Just this one little segment left to go. Alrighty, we are reclamped, ready to go. Set back down, stitch this section. So I showed you how to break thread before, and now let me show you how to pull up your thread to get started. I think I'm going to get started about right here. The edge of my foot is roughly kind of on the edge of the line, this inside line on the pedal. and that's going to put my needle at 1/4 inch away. I like that spot. And then when I line up my ruler, I'm going to quilt something that looks like this, where it's coming back around and it's going to mimic the angle of that petal. I like that. And it's going to set the stage for the rest of the petals. They're going to have a really nice angle. All right, so now I'm going to needle down, needle back up. That's just using the button on the machine. Now I'm going to hang on to this top thread. I've definitely got my foot in the down position. That is important. So I'm going to slide the machine over and tug on this top thread. That pulls up a loop. That loop is your bobbin thread. So you just tug on that and then bring both together. Now, if you use your thread cutter when you're cutting your thread on your whole machine, if you have a Janome 1600 like I'm using, then it will cut the threads really, really short. Just keep that in mind whenever you go to pull up that loop and you don't find anything there. It means that your bobbin thread's really short and you might have to use some tweezers to help you pull that around. And I'll show you that. I'll try and remember to show you that at the end of this. All right, so here we go. Click on my machine, swing down and around. And remember, our method is always to stitch back. So here I'm going to travel back along that ruler. There we go. That looks good. I'm already starting to branch out for the next feather. And I just hook that ruler around. But here I have a much better visual. I can actually really see what I'm doing. It's not hidden by the foot. I can see that 1/4 inch between this little curve and that line of stitching. And I'm going to back this off just a little bit, just so I'm sure as I stitch over, it's going to form that nice feather shape, and it's not going to go beyond that. There we go. And now travel stitch back. That's looking good. Now you might notice a little bit of shifting. It's just, you know, there's so much of this quilt that's already quilted. It's giving me a little bit of move here and there. If I roll my clamp forward a little bit, I get a little bit more tension. So that might help a little bit, but that might shift things around. So just keep that in mind. And you kind of just have to get a little bit more experience. To be honest, this is the first time that I've really quilted with rulers on my home machine, and certainly on this machine on the frame. So this is my very first try at it, and I'm learning as I go. And I'm already saying that that little bit of movement is annoying, and we just need to figure out how to work with that. I think bag of beans, quite honestly, I might find my bag of beans, bag of rice, plop it on here, and that, you know, kind of use up a little bit of that space that I'm having, that little bit of slack that I'm having in the quilt. So you saw there that I nudged the ruler back. It was because the length of that feather angle was a little longer than this section of the ruler. Just nudge your feather ruler back and then bring it back forward. That works fine. Now that it's out of position though, I'm gonna have to be a little careful, maybe a little shifty as I come down. That looks good. Shift the ruler this way. And again, not lining that up absolutely perfectly, just kind of eyeballing both the edge line of the ruler and that end curve of the ruler. Those two things are the things that help me align this. And especially when you are stitching it in something like this quilt, it's not gonna be absolutely perfect. Okay, I'm trying for a little speed here. I didn't click off my sure stitch. I left it running. So I tried to reposition nicely. I got a little bit of a wobble at the end of that feather. That's not the end of the world. Not the end of the world. All right, shifty. This time I did click it off just because I like it to be perfect. There we go. And we're gonna have a little bit of a cut off feather here at the end. And I do have, you know, a video where I break down lots of different ways that you can merge this, you know, connect this together, do that join. I've got my thread break. I just got to get that thread out of the way. And now all I'm going to do is just really focus on that end. I'm going to swing around, connect with the feather before, and then probably travel stitch down. So there we go. I've connected with the feather before, move that out of the way. But I want to eyeball where that would come in, where I would have that angle would be somewhere about there. So I'm going to travel stitch down, That would really be nice to have a bag of beans right there. Bag of beans puts pressure on the quilt, and that puts pressure on your machine bed, and that stops it from moving so easily, and that can help you. So bag of beans, like a 1 pound bag, really, really helpful. All right, I'm gonna stitch that little line, stitch back up, and I'm done. There we go. Click that off. And you can see, I could have left that open. I didn't necessarily need to stitch it, but by stitching it, it really looks better. Okay, to break thread, I'm going to, again, lift my needle, lift my foot, pull away. So I've spooled out both top thread and bobbin thread, okay? Now, if I did not have a thread cutter, I would drop my foot, drop my needle, bring it back up again, push it out of the way, and clip that. And that ensures that I have a nice long bobbin thread tail, nice long top thread tail. And I think that this is really the best way of doing it, simply because you end up with nice long thread tails top and bottom, and you end up with nice long thread tails to begin with again. So let me show you the alternative would be, let me pull this out so that way you're not confused. So let's just pretend that this bobbin thread isn't there, okay? And basically what I would do is I would pull the machine over so I have nice long thread tails, foot in the down position, and then I'd hit my thread cutter. So that would be, it's a simplified, process. It's a little bit simpler and a little easier, but here's the downside. As I go to start another line of stitching, I needle down, needle back up. Look at that baby thread tail. See how tiny it is? This is why I keep a pair of tweezers in my quilting caddy, because I have to grab that and pull on it with tweezers in order to get it to the top. So downside, there's always a downside to everything. Downside of thread cutters is cutting the thread so short that you have to use tweezers in order to pull it up through the foot. So I will be honest, I generally do this method where I pull over and then needle down, needle back up in order to bring that thread tail up to the surface. And the reason why is because that's just my habit now, having had long arms without thread cutters for so long. And it's not that hard, and you get into a habit of anything, it's fairly easy. So now that I have my thread tails here, I tie off and bury these. I have a video on how to do that step by step, leahday.com/hide threads. So there we go. That is the rest of my feathers filled in, beautifully stitched on the Dream Big panel. So that's it for this video. I hope you learned a lot. I know I certainly did. This was a fun experiment, just a fun, I wonder if that will work. That's really what I was asking myself. And it did, because a hoop frame works more like a traditional lap hoop. A traditional lap hoop would be, kind of think of an circular embroidery hoop or a square quilt hoop. Different people have different frames of reference with this. So those style of hoops, basically you put the quilt on top of it and then you clamp it in place, either with multiple clamps or one single, hoop ring, right? And then of course, once you quilt that segment, then you shift it over and you quilt the next segment, and you can quilt kind of whatever space that you want to quilt next. And you can also, it also doesn't really matter if it's, straight or angled or however you're doing it, so long as, it's nicely hooped and, secured within that frame. The hoop frame, the Q-Zone Hoop Frame, Q-Zone Hoop Frame Pro, they work the exact same way. So if you have a weird space like I did on this Dream Big panel, and you want to quilt that space and it's gonna not fit within the arm of your machine, then rotate the quilt, shift it around so that you have it fitted into that area. The space that you have to quilt in on the hoop frame is always going to be narrow and long, okay? So the hoop frame itself, the footprint, is 4.5 feet long. But whenever you put your carriage and your machine and everything on there, it shrinks that width a little bit. And I found I have about 36 inches from side to side. Now, if I measure on this particular machine, I have kind of a bulky foot on this machine. I love this foot, by the way, but the spring actually hits my clamps before the needle does, and I actually really like that, because I had trouble before with a different machine. The needle would actually nearly come in contact with these back clamps, and it was always terrifying when I heard that loud noise. So the back of the foot actually makes contact with those clamps, and if I start measuring from there and press firmly, and then I pull the machine forward, I have right at 5 3/4, let's say 5.5 inches of quiltable space. That is my vertical. So 5.5 inches by about 36. So it's going to be a short, long rectangle. And that's the kind of mental picture that you want to have whenever you're thinking about quilting any space. You know, had this area been bigger, had my petal been even bigger, then I might have had to stop and shift the quilt before I was able to continue quilting those designs, those shapes. But in this case, I was able to knock out both spaces with only one shift, and I was able to align that space so it was parallel with my rails. So this is something you just want to think about. If you're quilting something different, if you're quilting something weird, try and line it up so it's parallel with your rails here, the front and back bars. And that means that you're lining it up so that you have the greatest amount of space to quilt in with that one pass. And just in case you're wondering, if that seems absolutely outrageous, like who would want to quilt in 5.5 inches of space? That's so limiting. Keep in mind, you can put long arms on this frame. You can put a Qnique 15M, 15R, 15 Pro, or a Qnique 19 on this little hoop frame. The advantage of starting with a home sewing machine is it's the machine you already have, or it's just going to answer that question of, are you interested in frame quilting? It is space saving. I can tell you right now that this is actually a smaller setup than I use if I am pushing the quilt under the needle and having the machine in a table, because I have nice big tables set up to support the weight of the quilt. This is a lot smaller than that. So, you know, there's always upsides and downsides to everything. You know, when I'm quilting on a home sewing machine in a table, the upside is I can quilt in all directions. I am not limited by my quilting space. I can quilt diagonals all the way across the quilt, fine, no big deal. It's a lot harder to do on a frame. The downside is I'm pushing the quilt through the arm of the machine. I'm fighting that bulk, I'm fighting that weight. You know, I'm dealing with, you know, shoulder, neck issues. I'm struggling to see without craning my neck over. All of those things can crop up. And then also I have to have a big setup in order to support the weight of the quilt. I have to have a place for that big quilt to go behind the machine, to the side of the machine. The upside of the hoop frame is it takes up less space, and it's easier. It feels physically easier because the machine is moving, not the quilt. The downside is you might end up with a narrow, long space, and that's your quilting space. And you gotta make the best of it, right? You can always upgrade. You can always move to a Qnique 15 or a Qnique 19. The front of this frame expands forward so that you can get more space. On a Qnique 15, you will probably have around 10 inches of quilting space. On a Qnique 19, you'll have 14 to 15 inches of quilting space. That's 14 to 15 inches tall by 32 inches wide. You lose a little bit more space with the long arm because we have kind of big legs that extend a little bit, and that reduces the space a little bit side to side. So around 15 to 32 on a Qnique 19. So keep this in mind. It might seem a little crazy to fiddle with this, to bother stitching it like this, but I had a great time. And I know I was faster quilting those feathers when I'm moving the machine versus moving the quilt. So I thought this was a cool experiment. I really enjoyed sharing it with you. If you enjoyed this video, or if you have more questions, please post in the comments below. You can find the Janome 1600, the Q-Zone Hoop Frame, Q-Zone Hoop Frame Pro, Sure Stitch Regulator, speed controller that I mentioned in this video, any of the tools and accessories you saw in this video, as well as the feather ruler. You can find all of this and more at leahday.com/grace. So come and check that out, and until next time, let's go quilt.